So let me read our congratulations to LeRoy. So he is the 2019 recipient of the SFS Award of Excellence. LeRoy's contribution to our understanding of the interconnections among river hydrology, ecological processes, and human society is unparalleled. LeRoy is likely best known for his innovative research revealing the complex associations linking flow regimes to ecological responses. His influential 1997 publication, The Natural Flow Regime, laid out in highly accessible writing the fundamental concept that an unaltered stream exhibits variability in flows across different timescales that is critical to ecosystem function. It was a forward-thinking paper that was pivotal in advancing river management beyond a narrow focus on minimum flows. LeRoy has also advanced the use of trait-based studies in stream ecology and the understanding of the impacts of impoundments and climate change on freshwater ecosystems. He is in the vanguard of scientists who strive to synthesize scientific findings into knowledge and then translate that knowledge into practice. This includes the development of ecologically meaningful flow metrics, sophisticated yet feasible decision support tools, and frameworks for balancing ecological and societal needs for freshwater. He has helped implement these concepts by working directly with cities like Seattle and Fort Collins, state agencies in Massachusetts, Florida, and California, and also the federal agencies like USGS and the U.S. Forest Service. Today, many U.S. states and countless countries across the world have regulatory language that protects in-stream flows that were built on the scientific foundations developed by LeRoy. Finally, LeRoy's creativity and passion are renowned. He challenges all around him to think broadly and creatively about how to solve problems, whether they are how to plan a research study, run an effective interdisciplinary graduate program in ecology, or how to conserve and manage water in the world's rivers. And so it's with my great pleasure to give LeRoy Poff the 2019 Award of Excellence in Freshwater Science. It is richly deserved.
Well, thank you, Jen, and let me just say that I'm truly humbled and incredibly honored to receive this award. It's been sort of a lifetime aspiration of mine since I started coming to NABS meetings in 1983, and in the 36 years since that first meeting, I think I've missed three NABS meetings, maybe four, and we call them SFS now, but old-timers like myself still refer to NABS, so thank you so much. Before I get started, I wanted to take a moment to dedicate this presentation to my parents who always supported me in my interests and passions, even though they didn't know what I was really doing. And they passed away well before I received a permanent university position, but I know, I know they would be proud, so thank you. I've entitled this talk, The Urge to Save Rivers, and using science to do so. And I have to ask myself, where did that urge come from? Because I've always wanted to be sort of a river promoter, and I spent a lot of time growing up in the Ozarks, catching frogs and crayfish, camping and canoeing on Ozark rivers. So I'm sure that was part of my formation. But there was also an event that happened when I was 8 years old. I lived in a small town in north central Arkansas, and there was a beautiful Ozark River that ran through the area. And I used to go swimming under this bridge. My grandfather was actually killed on this bridge in a car accident, so I have a lot of history with that location. And in 1963, we had a very special visitor to Heber Springs, Arkansas, which was John F. Kennedy, who dedicated the dam that was built on the Little Red River, and I actually attended the dedication and saw him, and this was 1 month before he was assassinated in Dallas. So that made a very strong impression on me, and it was only later that I realized that what had formerly been this, lovely warm water river in the Ozarks was now with very dramatic, native fishes that I saw people catch a lot using things like trot lines, was converted into a dammed river with a world-class trout fishery beneath it. So I felt like a real loss over the years as I understood more that this kind of situation was happening all over the place. So I guess to go from there, my first sort of formal introduction to stream ecology after finishing a master's degree at Indiana University was at the Savannah River plant, the Savannah River site, the Savannah River Ecology Lab, where it's in South Carolina, where I met and worked with people who I've kept in touch with over the years. Robin Matthews was my primary mentor. Then I worked with Rick Hauer in SREL for a year. Boris Kondratiev, longtime friend. Fred Benfield was also partially involved in this. So that was a very formative experience for me, and I decided to go to graduate school, a PhD, and I went to Colorado State University, where I worked with James Ward. And this is a picture of me as a young and ambitious and not so well-groomed graduate student. And I've had to cover up my social security number on that because those used to be used for student ID numbers. So this is James Ward was well known, along with Jack Stanford, for working on regulated rivers. And so I found myself in the somewhat ironic position of being in graduate school to work on a regulated river when I sort of didn't like regulated rivers from my childhood experience. But James told me, he said, you can work on anything you want to as long as it's on a regulated river. So I thought, well, that's an interesting challenge. And particularly if you looked at the publication trends in the 80s, when I arrived in 84, you see here, basically, about before 1991, there's not much for applied ecology or conservation biology. In the 80s, it was about basic ecology, right? Many of you will remember that, who are ecologists. And so I had the challenge of saying, how do I do basic research if I want to be published and be successful in a regulated river? And so I picked a site on the upper Colorado River, about 7 kilometers below a hypolimnetic release dam, Granby Dam. This is the study site in the center, a beautiful stretch of the river. And I decided to work there, primarily because it had a couple of really interesting features. One was that it was incredibly stable temporally. I mean, they didn't let much water go out of this dam because it was always going over to the east slope. And so it had a very regulated and weightable hydrograph. Okay, so there was some temporal stability that could be manipulated through experiments in that regulated river. And so just as an example, I decided to do some drift studies using mayflies of different morphologies, thinking that they might respond differently to hydrologic manipulations. So I built some in-channel sort of diversions, and so I could raise and lower the water levels and see the response of these insects over time. And for 3 seasons, including the winter when it was sort of a little bit dicey oftentimes. So I got a couple of publications out of this, and I was quite happy with that. And then the other thing that this system had going for it was, because it was so stable, there was the spatial heterogeneity of the stream bed was essentially sort of not changing over time, because the velocities essentially remained the same. So I was interested in things like grazer-algal interactions and how they might change across gradients of microcurrent velocity, and so I did things like paint rocks and let them colonize in the stream for 8 months to get algae on them, and then look at them through a viewer, take pictures. I used the caddisfly, Agapetus boulderensis, and put in little painted pebbles of different colors on the stream bed so that they could, as they molted, they would pick up these pebbles and self-mark themselves. And in fact, if you have really good eyes and you're sitting up close, you can see these little self-marked caddisflies. So I could track them over time and make, I didn't get the slide in there, make maps of where they were, and then measure the velocity and measure the algae and generate these 3-dimensional surfaces and sort of build models about what regulated grazer movements. So that was fun. I really enjoyed that. And published on that as well. But the interesting thing, the serendipitous moment in my training was when James Ward offered a seminar called Topics in Aquatic Ecology or something like that, which was totally unformed. And I had this idea that I wanted to examine this sort of temporal variability in rivers and streams across the entire U.S., free-flowing streams, not regulated streams, because there was a raging debate in the literature at the time about what controlled community structure. Was it, stochastic control, which is environmental control, and, the environment's driving variation over time in communities, or is it deterministic, biotic interactions? And that's sort of, oversimplification, but that was basically the framing. And here are a couple of, sort of dominant theories at the time. And these models, they set expectations about what kind of structuring forces should be at play, but the challenge with these, because these have to be looked at in a comparative fashion right across a number of sites, was you have to know where you are on the stability curve or on that disturbance gradient. And people weren't doing that. Gary Grossman famously published a paper in which he looked at 12 Indiana streams or so, or 12 years of data, and just claimed that those communities that had high turnover from year to year were stochastically controlled, but there was no evidence of what the environment was like, and that really sort of bothered me. So I decided I wanted to investigate, try to quantify how much variability there was actually in rivers and streams across the U.S. And these, on the right you see some hydrographs, and we all know that hydrographs are very different from place to place, so there's a lot of long-term data. It seemed like, a doable thing. And then try to relate these differences in disturbance regimes to sort of expected evolutionary and ecological processes and patterns that should reveal across those gradients or manifest. So really what I was doing was trying to quantify hydrology from an ecological perspective. And so I came up with these, what I thought were ecologically relevant hydrologic metrics, right? They characterize the regime, the flow regime, mostly here in the context of disturbance. So how frequently and do floods occur, or low flow periods? What's their timing? What's their predictability, et cetera? So this set me off in what I would call a big data 1980s style, in which I actually, on my campus, we had something called a library that I actually went to with some frequency back in the day. And so the USGS published summaries of all the streams gauges in the country, and so we had to go read these summaries to determine whether or not a stream was disturbed or not, right? And I had a dam on it or whatever. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And I came up with what looked like maybe 78 streams that I could analyze. And then I got on my telephone, the hotline to Reston, Virginia, where I asked them to send me some data for these streams, and they maintained them on magnetic tapes. So I got some exciting mail for a few weeks, about 8 or 10 of these tapes for 78 streams. Then I had my assistant in the computer science lab mount the tapes and download the data and the assistants were females back in that day, so I'm not being, hopefully not being too crude here. Anyway, I extracted the data with Fortran and then analyzed those data to try to characterize the similarities and differences among these streams in terms of their hydrologic variability. And so just as I was finishing my PhD, I published this paper with James Ward that was in the Canadian Journal. I tried to submit it to AmNat. I was rejected, so it was sort of like didn't fit in. It was too much hydrology and biology together. So these 78 streams are plotted across the U.S., and I used a clustering routine to come up with 9 groups of streams, ranging from intermittent to perennial. And this figure shows these streams into 3-dimensional space. So the snowmelt streams are in the blue at the top, basically are distinct in that they have high flood predictability on the vertical axis, but low to moderate flood frequency, and high overall flow predictability. Okay? Now contrast that to groundwater streams, which are much less predictable and have much higher flow predictability. And then intermittent flashy streams are partly intermittent, but they also have low predictability and high frequency of flooding. So there appear to be really distinct differences among different types of streams, and if you believe in typologies and clustering things together, this sort of illustrates that pretty nicely. And so the idea then was to say, take those stream types and try to project or predict some kinds of trait or biological attributes, how they should vary across these stream types. So this is a little hierarchical model here on the right that basically shows those types. And you're going on from intermittency, the top, it's hard to see. See if this works. Not up there. So basically intermittent streams are on the upper left, and then to the right they become more perennial streams. And for intermittent streams, they're probably dominated by stochastic or abiotic controls, right? There's not much environmental stability, at least that was my graduate school idea. In terms of perennial streams, this larger blow-up box, it's the combination of flood frequency and flood predictability that sort of partition those different stream types that I modeled. And basically some of them may be biotic, some may be abiotic. If they're highly predictable and flood a lot, they may be seasonally biotic. So this is a way of trying to put some quantification around environmental variability, which is obviously something that we care a lot about in our systems. And this kind of typology provides sort of an evolutionary and ecological context for how species ought to vary across the landscape. And it also can provide a context for how, when individual streams are modified by dams, how they are modified relative to the historical, the natural flow regime, and therefore have some predictive capacity in that way as well. I'm not going to belabor this partly because you can't read it, but basically there was a table in the paper that listed the kinds of traits that we might expect to see in these under different combinations of intermittency or flood frequency and so forth. And so for intermittent streams, some traits that are listed are things like diapause and estivation traits, small body size for fishes, increased physiological tolerance, etc. And so this exercise, the seminar exercise, also brought me to a beginning of an understanding of the importance of traits as a currency that can be generalized across different systems and even across different biogeographic regions, because we're not talking about the identities of species, rather we're talking about the traits of these species. So in 1990, I went off to the University of Maryland for a postdoc with Dave Allen, and who I interacted with on a one-to-one basis for about several months, and then he went off to the University of Michigan. But we continued to have a wonderful collaboration over the several years. And I also worked with Margaret Palmer. She was a new assistant professor at Maryland and had very similar research interests. And so I consider both of these people really great friends, and they've been so over many years. And I really relished that experience. I also worked as a senior scientist. I was actually the only scientist, the sole scientist, at Trout Unlimited National for a year in the mid-90s. So these are the things that I wanted to look at in Maryland. I wanted to test this idea about predicting trait distributions. I wanted to think about trait-based ecology more, and also about hydrologic variation in a more sort of a conservation context. So one of the questions I asked was about whether stream community structure can be explained by natural hydrologic variability. This was a project I did with Dave, and it's sort of another big data project. I mean, I constructed a data set of 34 sites in Wisconsin and Minnesota where there was flow and fish data. And so for each of these sites, I characterized the hydrologic regime, and then using a clustering routine. There were two different types of fish communities, one that was more sort of specialist and one that was more generalist. And so the question was, can these different community types across these 34 sites be partitioned by the variation in the hydrologic regime? And so the answer, it was published in Ecology, so the answer was yes. So that was very fortunate. But basically what you see here is the more stable or specialist species. Well, there's a hydrologic gradient along the bottom from more flashy on the left to stable on the right. And the blue bars represent the more specialized communities type, and they occur on the more stable end of the spectrum. And likewise, the orange are the more stochastically driven, I guess. And that was highly significant. So that was a good outcome. And this was probably the earliest demonstration of testing of this hypothesis. And it's, lots of other people have gone on to do things like this, and this is a really, I think, an important thing for us to be doing. Then I had this sort of crazy idea. I was invited to a special symposium on new concepts in stream ecology that was at the Savannah River Ecology Lab in 1996 or something. And I was thinking more about these traits all along, and I sort of hatched this idea, which I don't know really exactly where it came from, but about this sort of hierarchical relationship. We all think of Frizzell's work and how stream systems are hierarchically organized, and it seemed to me that there are different physical processes that can be working at those different levels in that hierarchy to sort of filter out particular kinds of traits. So at like the watershed scale, you have climate and hydrology. At the reach scale, you may have bed stability that can influence disturbance regime. Local scales could be substrate size. So basically, this was just an exercise of going through and imagining what all traits could be involved and could be filtered at different levels in order to give you what you see at a local community level. Okay, and so this trait approach has been. I think that particular paper sort of got a lot of people thinking about this. It hasn't really been tested thoroughly, that particular idea. I have some data, it's about 95% done. I should publish that sometime. But this trait approach has become pretty common in our field. And in 2006, I was invited to write this Rosemary Mackay paper. And so along with Julian Olden and Deb Finn, who were students of mine at the time, well, had been and were, we characterized the traits for all North American lotic taxa, or 311 taxa, in terms of 20 traits that had a number of categories. And then these were things like life history traits, mobility traits, morphological traits, and ecology traits that should reflect some kind of quote-unquote mechanistic relationship with an environmental regime. So along a thermal gradient, you would expect to see more thermally tolerant or species. And along a disturbance gradient, maybe more mobile species, right? So these ideas have gone quite far with a lot of people, and I'm really happy about that. In fact, I've been involved a couple times in coming up with trait lists for other groups of taxa, like fish, which was done by Merrill Mims and Julian Olden, and I contributed to that, and riparian plants. We talk about flow guilds now in some ways. And so I participated with Dave Merritt on that, who led that, and Dave Lytle was also involved in that. And then I had a student, Matt Pine, and I have done quite a bit of work on how we can use traits to examine biological response to climate change. Okay, so, all right, third question was really about how to support river conservation and management using the scientific understanding that was emerging from this hydrologic analysis. And so Dave Allen was working at the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of American Rivers at the time, and I was working at Trout Unlimited, and we were having these conversations about, well, how can we bring science to the NGOs? The NGOs were really hungry for some science that said minimum flows aren't everything, right? And that was a real problem with sort of that kind of management. So Dave and I mounted a collaborative effort with academic researchers and NGOs, including Brian Richter of the TNC, who was involved in this. And really one of the aims was to provide basically a hammer that could be beat on the table about why minimum flows aren't enough. And I think this paper occurred, it was nothing really novel. It was really sort of a synthesis and a framing in a way that could reach people. And this was just about the time that the internet was taking off. And this actually sort of became very widely distributed through the internet, and things like watershed councils on the West Coast were all picking it up, and it was a really well-timed paper that sort of synthesized our collective understanding of rivers in a particular dimension. There was some cool outgrowths of this. So Dave Lytle invited me to co-author a paper with him on our species really adapted to natural flow regimes, and so we did a fairly rigorous look at that. And I also show this nice graph on the right, which you see in a lot of places. It's a three-dimensional hydrograph that shows when a dam was put in on the Green River, and what you see is to the right, this sort of seasonal, winter low flows in the red and then high spring flows, and then after the dam's put in, it all becomes sort of green. So it homogenizes that flow regime for the river, right? And that's been demonstrated many times over. And then at the bottom there are a lot of dams in the U.S., in the world as well. And there's my little dam, my hometown dam, circled in red, and it's just one of 75,000 or so. So, we have a lot of work to do to try to protect rivers, to save rivers in the face of all this infrastructure. So I put together about 10 years ago, I put together a little sort of synthesis of, I like to do this, sort of how I think about how things work. And so I sort of start with this idea of the habitat template, and we can think of the flow dynamics as being a part of that, and then species are filtered through that template based on their appropriate traits, and we end up with some communities, local community, right? Invasive species or non-natives can be put through that template as well. Of course, that template has other drivers that we oftentimes don't, particularly in the field of environmental flows, I'll talk about briefly, we don't really pay much attention to, and they're multi-scale, okay? So if you think about that altogether, I have this three-dimensional sort of template that has a habitat stability axis, a thermal regime axis, and a food resource axis, and a bunch of traits of species that are arrayed along those axes. So, high thermal regime, hot temperatures, we would expect to have, high thermal preference, high thermal tolerance. And so you can put your community somewhere in that space, depending on what the combination of drivers are, and if something changes in the, say the climate or something, that community may have to shift to a new regime. And so indeed, by putting landscape change in this figure, including climate, we can maybe have a way to start thinking about how systems will respond to changes from the status quo. And that idea was really sort of parlayed into one of my great research experiences over my career in the last 7 years or so, was a comparative study of aquatic species sensitivity to climate change along elevation gradients in Colorado and Ecuador. That was really built sort of around that model. And so here are my collaborators on that project, and some are in the room. I think Steve Thomas is here. Chris Funk, the handsome guy on the far right. Chris is down here in the front row. Chris is from CSU, and he's if you want to know anything about frogs and genomics of frogs, he's the guy to talk to. So it's his first NABS meeting. So you're not going to match mine, Chris. All right. And so we published a nice paper in PNAS recently that sort of summarized all this work. All right. So I want to briefly go through sort of what I've been doing in the 20 years since I returned to Colorado State. And notice in our graph again now the bars are shifting after 1997. There's a lot more applied ecology and conservation biology, and so now we're no longer in the age of basic science or basic research. Although that's always important, and I don't mean to dismiss that out of hand. And I think a lot of this transition sort of was stemmed from Jane Lubchenco, who wrote a really important paper in 1998 about the new social contract for science, where we as scientists have an obligation to address pressing problems, and people have different views on that, but I think that was clearly represented a transition point in ecology, and certainly I think many of us in the room today are thinking along those terms, and these challenges are only becoming greater. And when you're at a university, it's really great to have great colleagues. And I mean, at CSU, I had such wonderful colleagues. Many of you know people in this, or have heard of people in this picture. So this was like a really, stream ecology powerhouse there. It was really a wonderful place to be. And it also helps to have students, good students. And here are pictures of my PhD students at CSU since 1997. Deb, up in the upper left, Deb was my first student. She was a master's student, and then she went on for PhD. So Deb likes to be at the front of the line, so she deserves it in this case. All right. So, and here are master students that have worked with me, including Jeremy Monroe. I don't know if I think Jeremy will be here, but most of us know Jeremy from his work in Freshwater Illustrated. He actually convinced me to buy him an underwater camera casing when he was a student. There was nothing in the budget, but he was very persuasive, and I guess I'm glad I did. All right, so I think what we're facing, what I'm facing in my own future is this sort of challenge. I mean, how do we conserve biodiversity and given all the stresses and strains on our natural systems? And clearly hydroecology is a really important part of that. And we have all these existing dams, and so one question is how do we get better flows beneath these dams in order to promote diversity and sustain ecological functions. And of course, then the other big issue, emerging issue, is on a global scale. There are thousands of new dams that are proposed, mostly in the developing world, and these will be hydropower dams, which are particularly damaging. And so, how can we, help? Can we use our science to help design better dams? And that's a controversial question, but I think at least where dams are inevitable, and that's not always the case, but where they are inevitable, I think we have an opportunity and maybe an obligation to try to give better design. So that, and I have one slide on that in a moment. And so in this phase of my work, I would say my three primary collaborators have been Brian Richter, who was head of global water in the Nature Conservancy, who's really such a productive scientist. Angela Arthington from Griffith University in Australia, done a lot of fundamental work. We've collaborated a lot. And then in terms of thinking about non-stationarity or climate change, I really learned a lot from John Matthews, who's the director of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And we all talk about the environmental flows. That's a term now I think that's very commonplace in our world anyway. And environmental flows is really sort of cast as benefiting both humans and nature, right? But we have to have water of adequate quality that's delivered at the right time and in the right quantity. So this is really sort of like a redux of the natural flow idea, right? But this is a really important concept, and it's being taken up on a global scale by not just scientists, but also regulators and governments to various degrees of success. So I think my largest contribution in this arena was probably leading a 19-author publication to generate a scientific consensus that allows us to credibly guide development of e-flow needs at regional scales where we don't have a lot of information, right? And that's most of the world. So these systems are being stressed and degraded. We don't have all the site-specific knowledge we need in order to make the absolute best decision. So what do? We try to come up with some scientifically credible approach that allows us to sort of backfill and triage, I suppose. So this work sort of stemmed out of some work that Angela and Stuart Bunn and I and Bob Nyman did a few years earlier, but this was a much sort of bigger expansion of that. So in this approach, obviously, I'm sure many of you have seen this. We have sort of this, we characterize the hydrology, how much the hydrology has been altered, We have these ecological hypotheses about how species or whatever states, ecosystem states, should change in response to flow alteration. And then these orange boxes at the bottom, that's the social, societal input. I mean, we as scientists obviously can set what we think are critical environmental flows, but unless there's a societal agreement, then that's not going to happen. And so this model has been widely uptaken and sort of adopted. I mean, people try to expand more of the social element of it, and people have tried to sort of tack on culture. We need to talk about cultural flows as well, right? The indigenous people's rights to cultural water. So we'll see if this model persists. It's looking a lot like a Microsoft computer. It's getting all these add-ons on it, but we'll see how it goes. There's a lot of research and practice in this area. Special issues of scientific journals on e-flows, books, including Angela's book there, and a really nice book on the right edited by Avril Horn, lead editor. Policy guidance documents, applications to large river basins. So these are more like, conservation planning documents that look at things like the Susquehanna River Basin and how can we sort of use Aloha kind of methods to sustain that diversity across that system. U.S. agencies have been involved as well. So the USGS, actually for the last 10 years or so, has been actively working with state agencies and state agencies to facilitate environmental flow approaches, okay? And if you haven't seen this report on the right that the EPA and the USGS published shortly before, in late 2016, it's a really great compilation of sort of the science of hydrologic alteration. So if you're into that, that's a really good publication. And then, interestingly, sort of large-scale efforts are underway. Certainly on the right, the Murray-Darling Basin is sort of the poster child of e-flows experimentation and management. On the left, the California Bay Delta Update Plan has really embraced the scientific part of that, has really embraced sort of the natural flow regime and e-flows for trying to sustain that really complex and compromised whole basin. So the last thing I want to close with idea is that I think environmental flows has a really good future, and it's really important that we get it right. And there's a lot of scientific uncertainty. There'll be sessions at this meeting that talk about that. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years is climate change and non-stationarity. And I know we're all thinking about that at some level. It's just sort of increasingly important and obvious. But, if we look at the Aloha framework and we ask, okay, how can we use that going forward? And you look at the different things in there are several components of that framework that are actually built on an assumption of stationarity, that the climate's not changing. Things like baseline hydrographs, right? And the degree of hydrologic alteration. I mean, if the baseline itself is changing and the alteration is naturally occurring, then that presents something that we have to think about and sort of, manage. Other things, ecological relationships with flow can also, change with climate. And of course, we strongly suspect that there'll be societal values and management goals may change as climate changes, and what represents acceptable ecological conditions, right? I mean, we're not going to control this, we're going to respond to this. And setting of environmental flow standards, and then maybe even eventually as novel systems emerge, we may say, well, we need to reevaluate our flow ecology hypotheses. So, this realization led me to think, well, something needs to be done in order to not leave this model sort of hanging out there as the climate shifts and people start saying, well, you've got too many bad assumptions in there, right? And I'm not saying that would necessarily happen, but it's my nature to worry about things like that. So I wanted to talk about one final paper that I published I'm very happy with. It came out in 2016, and it was really around this question of how do we manage for biodiversity conservation and ecosystem resilience in the face of non-stationary climate change particularly? But non-stationarity is it's a very broad concept. So what I've done here is what motivated me to work with John Matthews to create a succinct workshop on this topic was this idea that we as conservation ecologists, I'll use that term very broadly, could include interested stakeholders as well, people who want the river to survive and flourish because of its biological nature. We are struggling with ecological non-stationarity, right? Non-native species, invasive species. The question that we could ask 30 years ago, like what is ecological integrity, could be much more easily answered 30 years ago than now, because we have a lot of non-native species. What are we shooting for? What are our targets? We can't restore to some historical norm, right? Obviously, but what are we going to manage for? So this is creating, I think, sort of a rethinking, maybe not so explicitly, but people are thinking about this, and we'll see what emerges. And then, of course, hydrologic non-stationarity from a water resources management point of view is really a challenge, because if the climate's changing, then how do you design a reliable reservoir system to deliver water? Or how do you optimize for certain kinds of outputs? So, in my mind, this sort of dual non-stationarity that's being absorbed by traditionally sort of not necessarily friendly points of view about river management is creating some stress. So we as ecologists, I think, are moving more towards thinking about how do we make our systems resilient, able to persist in the face of insults, new changes, whereas the engineers are thinking more about how do we make our systems more robust? How can they perform under a wide range of future climates, okay? And so I think there's maybe an opportunity to bring these points of view together, find some overlap, and maybe have some new opportunities for ecologically sustainable management. Things like green infrastructure would be like a real simple notion. And so towards that idea, we published this paper in Nature Climate Change called Sustainable Water Management Under Future Uncertainty with Eco-Engineering Decision Scaling. And so Casey Brown of UMass Amherst was the engineer that sort of came up with this idea of bottom-up decision scaling. John Matthews and I led this. Ted Grantham was on this, and I think Ted will be here. So, and this is a really, I think, potentially a promising approach that basically, I encourage you to go look at the paper if you're interested, but the really cartoon version, in fact, the sort of the conceptual model that we put in the proposal, sort of look like this, where you've got a climate space, an X and Y axis, say average annual precipitation, average temperature, and you've got some engineering, some infrastructure, and that domain, that colored area within that is where you can operate with success within that climate space. And if it goes over the threshold into the white area, then that's failure. And we can do that same thing with ecosystems if we could get together and decide what it is we want, how we want to define ecological performance. And there's a domain of which we could have a resilient system in that climate space. So the idea is that if you could design infrastructure or operate infrastructure so that you're in a common domain of success, then that would be a really great thing. And this kind of approach can be applied to projected climate change, as we did in the paper, to sort of illustrate the risk of building certain kinds of combinations of infrastructure and with ecological endpoints relative to the projected climate change. So I think that's sort of, these kind of decision support tools are going to be things that we are going to be more and more called on to help provide to policymakers and to the public as our world becomes really more complex. All right, so I wanted to conclude by just sharing some thoughts with you from my perspective of having worked in streams for over 30 years and just some ideas about, particularly for younger people, younger scientists in the room, because these are going to be your problems for the next 30 NABS meetings, and I don't claim to have any answers, but I would just share my perspective with you, and hopefully that will be of some value. So how do you use your science to promote freshwater sustainability? And I would say, from my perspective, and what my early work in streams doing experiments taught me was you really need to know your system, okay? And you need to pay attention to detail. That's really important. It gives you credibility. And keep mechanism in mind. And the cartoon that I like that sort of reflects the importance of mechanism is this one, where I'm sure you've all seen it. You've got a mathematical string of relationships, and one person says, I think that you should be more explicit here in step 2, where a miracle occurs. So I think the more we understand mechanism, whether that's traits or process-based understanding, then the less we need miracles. Okay, that's one point. Another is, I think it's important not to over-complexify things. Sometimes simple answers are even better and more actionable. And so here are the two scientists looking at a long 1.999 forever, and the wise professor says, we should just round it off to 2 and go to lunch. So, I think, obviously we don't want to oversimplify things, but I think there's I've had experience where I think this is, a valuable perspective. I think creativity is sort of underemphasized in our field, but we as scientists are really very creative. And I always found that my most, impactful science and publications have come from when I tried to be creative. So, I encourage everyone, you to be creative in thinking about how to solve problems. And of course, that requires also being interdisciplinary and collaborative, and that's something that's pretty much the norm these days. That was not the case when I was a younger scientist. And then finally, be proactive. And we've heard a little bit about this earlier from Jen. Engage the public, engage policymakers, and there are a couple ways to do that. One is to, be a scientist citizen who's outspoken and has things to offer. But I think it's really important that we as scientists have a vision of a sustainable future that we can convey to the public. And also, then you can work behind the scenes. And I've had a lot of experience with that. It's sort of a relationship with Brian Richter, where I would do research and he would be able to promote it because he was not sort of bound by academic rules. All right, so I'd like to just say thank you then in closing to a lot of people. Of course, my students, whom I showed pictures of earlier, and also several postdocs and research scientists who've worked in my lab over the last 20 years or so. Funders, of course. And I haven't mentioned really my Australian colleagues. I've been working more in Australia in the last couple of years, and will probably continue to do so. And just wanted to acknowledge people that I've been collaborating with and really great scientists. And then, of course, my many friends and colleagues in SFS. I mean, that's made this meeting worth coming to for however many years. It's just always a wonderful experience, and people are so welcoming and sharing, and it's a really fabulous society. And I want to just thank everyone in this room for helping me along over the years. And then finally, I'd like to thank my wife, Rose, and my 2 children. And Rose has been with me pretty much since the beginning of the benthic experience, and has really supported my career in so many ways, and I really am proud that she's my wife and that she understands what benthology means. All right, so I know I've taken a little extra time. I learned that the second speaker was not going to be here, so I snuck in some more slides. But I hope that what I have had to say, my little personal journey through my career, has been worth your time. So thank you very much.